The air in the guffaw was always thick, a heavy blanket of stale beer, sticky soda, and the faint, desperate scent of floor cleaner that never quite won the war. For her, it was the smell of a paycheck. She moved through the dimly lit tables not like a person, but like a part of the club's machinery. Her feet knew the worn path between the kitchen and the far corner booth by memory. Her hands could balance a tray of 4 full glasses through a boisterous crowd without a second thought. She was in her late 20s, with a face that was pleasant enough but easy to forget, and eyes that missed nothing. To the comedians who basked in the single spotlight, she was a shadow. To the patrons laughing at their jokes, she was a refiller, a plate clearer, a silent, necessary function. She was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. This invisibility was her shield, and it was also her superpower. People forgot she was there. They said things they wouldn't say if they thought a stranger was listening. She heard the businessman on his phone lying to his wife about working late. She saw the young couple on their first date, their knees miles apart under the table, their conversations stilted and full of awkward pauses, both of them secretly glancing at their phones in their laps. She watched the group of friends who came in every Friday, their laughter a little too loud, their stories a little too exaggerated, as if trying to convince themselves they were still happy, still young. She soaked it all in, the tiny dramas and the quiet heartbreaks that played out over sticky wooden tables and half-eaten plates of fries. Her real work began when the rush died down. The headliner would be on stage, the audience captive, and the flow of orders would slow to a trickle. In these small pockets of quiet, she would find a moment for herself. Tucked away in a corner booth, far from the main traffic, she would pull out a worn, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was plain black, the edges curled from use. It was her most prized possession. Inside, filled in a neat, small script, were not diary entries or to-do lists, but observations. Sharp, funny, and sometimes painfully honest little sketches of the world she saw. Tonight's subject was already on stage. He was the headliner for the week, a man with a suit that was too shiny and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had a way of holding the microphone that was both casual and possessive, like a king holding his scepter. His act was built on a foundation of cruelty, which he disguised as just telling it like it is. He'd scan the crowd, his eyes like a predator looking for the weakest member of the herd. "You, sir," he'd boom, pointing at a man in a cheap-looking shirt. "That shirt is a cry for help. Did your blind grandmother pick that out for you?" The crowd would roar with laughter, a nervous, relieved laughter that it wasn't them. The man would shrink in his seat, his face flushing a deep, painful red. The comedian would feed on that discomfort. His smirk widening, she watched him from the shadows of the bar, her expression unreadable. She didn't hate him. It was a more complex feeling than that. It was a mixture of pity and a strange, analytical fascination. She saw the terror behind his eyes, the desperate need for approval that drove him to tear others down. He wasn't a confident king. He was a bully, and like most bullies, he was deeply insecure. She saw the way he barely looked at the staff, snapping his fingers for a drink, never saying please or thank you. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a moving part of the scenery, a walking, talking prop that brought him water. She turned away from the stage and found her empty corner booth. The comedian's voice echoed through the club, a constant, arrogant drone. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Her pen flew across the paper, not just recording what she saw, but translating it. She wrote about the man on stage, but she didn't name him. She called him the Jester, and she described his kingdom of dim light and forced laughter. She wrote about his court, the people who came to watch him, how they would sacrifice one of their own for a moment of his attention and a shared laugh. Her words were not angry. They were precise, almost surgical. She dissected the dynamic of the room, the unspoken contract between the bully and his audience. She wrote about the man in the ugly shirt, how his smile had vanished, how he now stared into his drink as if it held the answers to all his regrets. She wrote about the woman on the first date, who was now laughing a little too loudly at the jester's mean jokes, as if to prove to her companion that she had a good sense of humor, that she was fun. The young woman's pen gave these small, invisible people a voice. She gave their silent struggles a weight and a dignity that the jester on stage would never understand. The comedian set was reaching its peak. He was in his element, the crowd was his, and he was merciless. But in that dark corner, a different kind of creation was taking place. The young woman filled pages with her quiet rebellion, her observations turning into something that felt like art. She was just a waitress, moving through the world unseen. But in the pages of her notebook, she saw everything. And soon, very soon, the world was going to see what she saw. She closed the notebook just as the lights came up for intermission, the spell broken. She slipped it back into her bag, her face once again a neutral mask, and stood up to clear the tables. The invisible woman went back to work, her secret safe for now, but the fire of it burning brightly inside her. Saturday night at the Guffaw was a different beast. The weekday crowds were sparse, a collection of tired regulars and the occasional lost tourist. But Saturday was the main event. The room was so packed you could feel the heat radiating from the bodies pressed together, a low, humming energy that vibrated through the sticky floor. Every table was full, the bar was 3 people deep, and the air crackled with a desperate need for entertainment. They had paid their money, bought their overpriced drinks, and now they were ready for a show. They were hungry for laughter, and the man on stage was more than happy to feed them. The headliner, the man she called the jester in her notebook, was in his element. The shiny suit seemed to sparkle under the harsh glare of the spotlight, and his smile was wider and more predatory than ever. He paced the stage like a caged tiger, his movements sharp and confident. He had the audience in the palm of his hand. He'd start with a few generic, pre-written jokes to warm them up, lines he'd told 1,000 times in 100 different cities. They were safe, and the crowd chuckled politely. But he wasn't here for polite chuckles. He was here for the big, explosive laughs that came from making someone else the butt of the joke. His eyes scanned the room, a laser beam searching for a target. They landed on a young woman near the front, a bit overdressed in a fancy blouse. Well, he began, his voice a smooth, condescending purr. Look what we have here. A lady who clearly thought she was going to the opera tonight. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The woman's smile tightened. No, honey, this isn't the opera. This is a comedy club. You can take the monocle off. He mimicked adjusting a monocle, and the laughter grew louder. He continued, gently at first, then with more bite, poking fun at her clothes, her date's nervous expression, the fancy phone she had on the table. He was a master at it, finding the tiny insecurities and blowing them up for everyone to see. The woman's date laughed along, a little too loudly, trying to show he was a good sport. The woman herself just shrank, her face a mask of frozen politeness. The jester had his first victim of the night, and the crowd had tasted blood. They wanted more. She watched from the side, her tray balanced on her shoulder. She was clearing a table near the stage, trying to be invisible, to do her job and disappear. She saw the whole ugly spectacle play out. She saw the way the comedian's eyes lit up when he found his target. She saw the way the crowd leaned in, their faces eager. It was a strange, ancient ritual. They were there to watch a sacrifice, and as long as it wasn't them, they were happy to be a part of it. The jester moved on, his gaze sweeping the room again. His set was starting to lose its momentum a bit. The pre-written material was running thin, and he needed another jolt of energy from the crowd. His eyes passed over the tables, over the faces laughing and drinking, and then they stopped. They stopped right on her. For a second, she thought she was mistaken. She was just the help, a piece of the furniture. But then a spotlight, a harsh, unforgiving circle of white light, found her. It blinded her, pinning her in place like a butterfly in a collection. The world went dark outside of that little circle of light. All she could see was the stage. All she could feel was the weight of 100 pairs of eyes suddenly swiveling to land on her. Ladies and gentlemen. The jester's voice boomed through the microphone, laced with a triumphant mockery. We have a true artist in our midst. A wave of confused murmurs and chuckles rolled through the club. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at her. Look at her. Working hard while we're all having fun. Dedication. The crowd laughed. this time with a clear understanding of what was happening. The game was afoot. "She's been here all week," he continued, his voice dripping with a fake, syrupy admiration. "She's heard all my jokes. Every single one. Probably thinks she could do better, right?" The crowd roared its approval, a hungry, animalistic sound. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants, egging him on. They sensed a public humiliation in the making, and it was far more exciting than any pre-written joke. "Come on up here," he shouted, gesturing with the microphone. "Let's give the hard-working lady a chance. The stage is yours." The applause was deafening. It was a wall of sound, a physical force that pushed against her. Her heart started pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mouth went dry. She could feel a flush creeping up her neck, a hot, prickly heat of embarrassment and panic. Every instinct screamed at her to shake her head, to mouth, "No," to back away into the safety of the darkness. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. She caught the eye of her manager, a tired, overweight man standing by the bar. He saw what was happening. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug, a look of helpless apology on his face. He couldn't stop it. The comedian was the star, the draw. He couldn't risk a scene by telling the headliner to leave his staff alone. She was on her own. What do you say? The jester's voice cut through the noise. "She's just a waitress. Let's make her play a joke." The crowd picked up the chant. "Do it! Do it! Do it!" It was a rhythmic, relentless demand. The spotlight felt hotter now, burning her skin. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. She thought of her notebook, tucked away in her bag under the bar. She thought of the sharp, precise words she had written just an hour ago. She thought of the quiet dignity she tried to give the people the comedian mocked. And now she was one of them. She was the target. The sacrifice. The chant grew louder. The pressure was immense, a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She felt small and exposed, a specimen under a microscope. The jester stood on stage, his arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had won. He had found his perfect victim, someone who couldn't fight back, someone the crowd would gladly see fail. He was waiting for her to crumble, to shake her head and slink away in shame. It would be the final punchline. She stood there, frozen in the blinding light, the roar of the crowd washing over her. For a long moment she did nothing. Her mind was a blank wall of panic. But then something shifted. Deep down, beneath the layers of fear and embarrassment, a tiny spark of anger ignited. It wasn't a raging fire, not yet. It was just a small, steady flame. Who was he to do this? Who were they to demand it? She looked at the faces in the crowd, some laughing, some just watching with morbid curiosity. She looked at the comedian on his stage, his kingdom of cheap laughs. She thought of all the invisible people she had seen, all the quiet struggles she had written down. And a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. The panic was still there. Her heart was still hammering, but the anger gave her a backbone. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to be his victim. She took a slow, deep breath. And then, with a deliberate, almost graceful movement, she bent down and placed her tray on the table she had been clearing. The glasses clinked softly, a small, clear sound that was somehow louder than the roar of the crowd. It was a simple act, but it was a statement. She was putting down her role, her invisibility. She straightened up, her back straight for the first time that night. She looked at the stage, not at the comedian, but at the microphone waiting in its stand. And then she took her first step. The few steps from her table to the stage felt like the longest walk of her life. Each footfall on the sticky floor seemed to echo in the sudden hush that fell over the room. The chanting had stopped. Now, there was only the low murmur of anticipation, a sound like a tide pulling back before a crash. The spotlight was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, bleaching the color from the world until all that existed was the small, raised platform and the man waiting for her on it. She could feel the eyes of every single person in that crowded room, 100 tiny points of pressure, all focused on her. They weren't seeing a person. They were seeing a spectacle. A lamb led to a comedic slaughter. As she got closer, she could see the comedian more clearly. He had leaned against the back wall of the stage, his arms crossed over his chest, a picture of smug, relaxed confidence. He was enjoying this. This was his favorite part of the show, not the jokes, but the power. The power to make someone uncomfortable, to control the room, to be the center of everyone's universe for a few precious moments. He gave her a small, patronizing smile as she mounted the 3 small steps that led up to the stage, a gesture that said, "Welcome to my world. Now watch me destroy you." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the microphone, waiting in its stand like a silver scepter. The stage felt strangely solid under her worn-out sneakers, a different texture from the floor she spent her nights navigating. The air up here was hotter, closer, thick with the heat from the stage lights. She reached the center of the spotlight's beam and stopped. The crowd was holding its breath. They were waiting for the stumble, the nervous giggle, the stammered, "I don't know what to say." They were ready to laugh at her, not with her, but none of that came. She didn't fumble with the stand. She didn't giggle nervously. She simply wrapped her fingers around the cool metal of the microphone and lifted it from its holder. The movement was smooth and practiced. She brought it to her lips, and for a moment she just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. Her eyes, which had spent so long observing from the shadows, now took in the whole room. She saw the eager faces, the drunk faces, the bored faces, the nervous faces. She saw the woman in the fancy blouse, her expression now one of sympathetic dread. She saw her manager by the bar, his face pale with anxiety. And she saw the comedian still leaning against the wall, but his smile had tightened just a little. He had been expecting fear. What he was seeing was not fear. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. "You know," she began, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick silence with surprising strength. It wasn't a loud voice, but it carried a quiet authority that made people lean in to listen. "It's funny you should ask me to tell a joke." She turned her head slightly, just enough to include the comedian in her gaze, though she still didn't look directly at him. "Because I do have a story. It's not a joke, not really. It's more of a observation." A confused ripple went through the crowd. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They wanted a quick, embarrassing failure, not a story. The comedian pushed himself off the wall, a flicker of impatience on his face. He was ready to step in and take back control if she started to ramble. She continued, her tone calm and conversational, as if she were telling a story to a friend over a cup of coffee. "Once, in a small, loud kingdom, there was a king." A few people in the audience chuckled, thinking this was some kind of silly setup. "His kingdom wasn't very big," she went on, ignoring them. "And his castle was a bit damp and always smelled of old beer, but he was the king. And everyone there was his subject." A few more people chuckled, a little nervously this time, as they looked around at the club's damp, beer-smelling walls. This king loved to hold court. Every night, his subjects would gather in the great hall, and he would entertain them. But the king was a strange sort of entertainer. He didn't sing songs or tell grand tales of adventure. No, his favorite game was to point at his subjects and call their clothes silly. He would find a man with a hole in his shoe and make everyone laugh at the man's feet. He would find a lady with a funny hat and make everyone giggle at her choice of fashion. And the courtiers, they would always laugh. They would laugh long and loud because the king was powerful, and it was better to be on his side, laughing with him, than to be the one he was pointing at. The room was getting quieter. The nervous chuckles had died away. People were listening. The comedian had stopped moving, his arms now hanging loosely at his sides. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes were fixed on her, sharp and alert. "The king had a shiny, empty crown," she continued, her voice softening, becoming more intimate. "And he loved the sound of the court's laughter. It made him feel big. It made him feel like a real king. But the truth was, the king was very, very tired. And he was scared. He was scared that if he stopped pointing at other people's silly clothes, if he stopped making them feel small, then everyone would see how small he really was. His power wasn't in his crown or his castle. It was in their fear. She paused, letting that idea hang in the air. The silence in the club was now absolute. You could have heard a glass drop. The air had changed. The hungry, bloodthirsty energy from before had vanished, replaced by something heavy and thoughtful. He would sometimes get bored, she said, her voice dropping even lower. He would run out of people with silly hats, so he would come up with a new game. He would point at the quietest person in the court, someone who served the drinks or swept the floors, someone no one ever noticed, and he would shout, "You think you're so quiet? You think you're better than us? Come up here and sit on my throne? Tell us a story." And the whole court would gasp and then cheer, because this was the best game of all. They were about to see someone ordinary, someone like them, get knocked off their feet by the great and powerful king. She was no longer just telling a story. She was painting a picture, and everyone in the room was in it. They were the courtiers. They were the ones who had been cheering. A shift of discomfort went through the audience. People started looking at each other, then at the comedian, then back at her. The connections were being made, one by one, like a silent chain reaction. But one day, she said, and her voice held a note of profound sadness, the king made a mistake. He chose the wrong person to bring to the front. This person wasn't a courtier. This person was a watcher, a quiet observer. And as this person stood before the king, they didn't see a powerful ruler. They just saw a tired, scared man in a shiny suit. And the watcher realized the king's greatest fear. It wasn't that someone would take his kingdom. It was that one day his court would look at him, truly look at him, and realize. She stopped. She looked out at the silent, captivated faces. She looked at the comedian whose mask of neutrality had finally cracked. She could see the panic in his eyes now, the dawning horror of what was coming. She took a soft breath and delivered the final line, not like a punchline, but like a sad, simple fact. He had no clothes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was heavy with the weight of 100 minds clicking into place at once. The story hung in the air, a perfect, devastating truth that wrapped around the room like a shroud. The laughter from just a few minutes ago seemed like a distant, childish memory. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, the truth of the story settling over them, changing the way they saw everything. The crowd wasn't laughing. They were thinking, and for a comedian who dealt in cheap laughs, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The silence that followed her final word was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, living thing, a presence that filled every corner of the club. It was the sound of 100 minds processing a single, uncomfortable truth all at once. In the harsh glare of the spotlight, you could see the change happening on people's faces, like a slow-motion wave. The smirks faded. The drunken, eager grins softened into expressions of dawning understanding, then into something that looked a lot like shame. They were not just a crowd anymore. They were individuals, each one suddenly remembering a time they had laughed at someone else's expense, a time they had gone along with the crowd to feel safe. The story she had told wasn't just about the man on the stage. It was about them. The comedian was frozen. His carefully constructed fortress of arrogance had been breached by a few simple, quiet words. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a panic he couldn't hide. The spotlight he had so confidently commanded now felt like an interrogation lamp, exposing every crack in his facade. He looked smaller up there, his shiny suit suddenly looking cheap and pathetic. He was no longer a king. He was just a man in a dimly lit room who had been found out. The power had drained out of him, leaving him hollow. Then a sound broke the spell. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't a heckle. It was a single sharp clap. It came from a table near the front. It was the woman in the fancy blouse, the one he had mocked earlier. Her hands came together once, a clear, decisive sound that cut through the thick silence like a knife. Her face was no longer frozen in polite embarrassment. It was set with a firm, quiet resolve. For a moment, that single clap hung in the air, alone and brave. Then a man at the bar joined in. Another clap. Then a couple in the back. It wasn't a wave of applause. It was a series of individual, conscious decisions. One by one, people began to clap. It started slowly, hesitantly, a scattered rhythm of hands coming together. But it grew. It built momentum, gathering strength and speed until the scattered claps merged into a single, thunderous roar. This was not the polite, obligatory applause that followed a mediocre set. This was something else entirely. It was a tidal wave of sound, a physical force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was an apology. It was a recognition. It was a roar of respect for the quiet woman who had found her voice and, in doing so, had given a voice to the silent dignity of everyone else in the room. The sound was so loud, so pure, that it felt like it could wash away the stale beer and the cheap laughs and leave something clean and real in their place. The comedian on stage flinched as, if the sound were a physical blow, he tried to regain control, to snatch his kingdom back. He stumbled forward toward the microphone, a desperate, panicked look on his face. All right, very good," he stammered, his voice cracking. She's a real storyteller, folks. Let's give a hand for the waitress." He tried to make it sound like a joke, but the words were dead in his mouth. The crowd's applause only grew louder, drowning him out. He tried again, forcing a laugh that sounded like a dog's bark. "Now for my next joke?" But it was useless. The spell was broken. He no longer had any power over them. They had seen something real, and they weren't interested in his cheap illusions anymore. He looked out at the sea of clapping faces, then at the woman standing calmly in the center of his stage. He had been defeated, not with insults, but with truth. He had been dismantled, not with a hammer, but with a quiet, precise observation. There was nothing left for him to do. With a final, humiliated glance at the audience, he turned and practically fled the stage, disappearing into the darkness of the wings without another word. And she, the center of all this attention, simply stood there. She didn't raise her arms in victory. She didn't take a bow. She waited for the sound to begin to subside, for the raw energy of the moment to settle. As the applause softened into a gentle, appreciative patter, she calmly placed the microphone back into its stand. The soft click it made was the only sound in the room. She then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the audience, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and turned to walk off the stage. As she made her way back to her table, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The hungry, predatory energy was gone, replaced by a warm, buzzing respect. People watched her walk by, not with mockery, but with a kind of awe. Some smiled at her, genuine, warm smiles. A few people reached out to pat her arm as she passed, murmuring quiet words of praise. She saw her fellow servers looking at her from across the room, their faces a mixture of shock and pride. One of them, a young man who usually just grunted at her, gave her a wide-eyed thumbs up and a grin that split his face. She reached her table and picked up her tray, the metal cool and familiar in her hand. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past few minutes was starting to fade, leaving a strange, trembling emptiness in its wake. Her heart was still beating fast, but now it was a rhythm of shock and disbelief. She had done it. She had spoken the words from her notebook, the secret thoughts she had never dared to say out loud. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, for a moment, it felt like it had just begun. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. The club's manager, a man who usually only spoke to her in grunts about dirty tables, came up to her. He didn't say much, just looked at her with a strange expression, a mix of concern and wonder. "That was something else," he finally said, his voice gruff but softer than she'd ever heard it. He told her she could take the rest of the night off, paid, of course. She nodded, too stunned to argue. As she gathered her things from behind the bar, the club was still buzzing. People were leaving, but they weren't in a hurry. They were talking to each other, not about the comedian who had run off stage, but about her, about the story, about the feeling in the room. She felt their eyes on her, but it was different now. It wasn't the gaze of a predator looking for prey. It was the gaze of people seeing someone for the first time. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had spoken the truth, and in the dim, smoky light of the comedy club, The truth shone brighter than any spotlight. The walk home that night was different. The city, which she usually navigated with her head down, her mind a blur of tables to be cleared and orders to be taken, seemed to come into a sharper focus. The cool night air felt clean against her skin, washing away the sticky, stale air of the club. The usual cacophony of sirens and distant music seemed to have a new rhythm to it. She felt a strange lightness, as if she had been carrying a heavy weight for years, and had only just now set it down. But beneath the lightness was a current of pure, unadulterated shock. She kept replaying the moment in her head, the feel of the microphone in her hand, the sight of the crowd's faces changing from mockery to understanding. It felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. When she finally got to her small apartment, she didn't turn on the TV or scroll through her phone. She just sat in the quiet dark, letting the reality of the night slowly settle over her like a soft, heavy blanket. The next morning, she was woken up not by her alarm, but by a persistent, buzzing sound. It was her phone vibrating itself off the nightstand. She picked it up, her eyes still heavy with sleep. The screen was a mess of notifications. Missed calls, text messages, and a flood of social media alerts. She had a few hundred new friend requests. Confused, she clicked on a link someone had sent her. It was a video. The title read, "Waitress silences a comedy club with one story." She pressed play and her heart skipped a beat. It was her. The video was shaky, filmed from a table near the front. She saw herself walking onto the stage, the blinding spotlight, the comedian's smug face. She watched herself speak, heard her own voice telling the story of the king with no clothes. The video ended with the thunderous applause, the camera shaking slightly as the person filming joined in. She spent the next hour in a daze, clicking through links. The video was everywhere. It wasn't just on local pages. It was being shared by big comedy accounts, by news outlets, by people from all over the world. But what struck her most was the conversation happening in the comments. It wasn't just people making fun of the comedian. It was people talking about her story. They were calling her a poet, a storyteller, a voice for the quiet people. One comment, with thousands of likes, read, "She didn't tell a joke. She told the truth." And the truth was funnier and more powerful than any punchline. Another one said, "I've been that person in the crowd laughing along because I was scared not to." This video made me think about that. They weren't just seeing a viral moment. They were seeing the art she had been quietly creating in her notebook for years. They saw the humanity in it. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. A cheerful, energetic voice on the other end introduced himself as a host from a local morning radio show. He said he'd seen the video and that everyone at the station was talking about it. "We have to have you on the show," he said. "Not to talk about the drama, but to talk about, well, whatever that was you did." It was brilliant. She felt a wave of panic. She was a private person, a writer in the shadows. The idea of speaking on the radio to thousands of people was terrifying. But then she thought about the comments, about the people who connected with her story. She took a deep breath and said, "Okay." The radio interview was a blur. She sat in a small, soundproof room, a pair of giant headphones clamped over her ears, her hands sweating. The host was kind, though, and he didn't try to trap her or make her talk badly about the comedian. He just asked her about her notebook, about where her stories came from. As she talked, she found her rhythm. She spoke about the beauty in small, everyday moments, about the dramas she witnessed, about the importance of really seeing people. She wasn't trying to be funny or witty. She was just being honest. And the host seemed captivated. When they hung up, he told her, "You have a real gift, you know. The world needs more of that. Not more jokes, more truth." That radio interview opened a new door. A few days later, she got an email. It was from a small, independent bookstore across town that hosted a weekly storytelling showcase. They had heard her on the radio. They didn't offer her a headlining spot or a lot of money. They just offered her a spot on their stage, a chance to share her stories with a small, attentive audience. She read the email a dozen times, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the next step. It wasn't a comedy club with a drunk crowd and a mean-spirited host. It was a quiet, respectful place. It felt right. She replied with a simple, "Yes, I'd be honored." The night of the showcase, she was more nervous than she had been at the comedy club. This time, there was no anger to fuel her, no bully to stand up to. This was just her and her words. The venue was nothing like the Guffaw. It was a small, cozy room filled with mismatched wooden chairs. The air smelled of old books and brewing coffee. The stage was just a small, raised wooden platform with a single stool and a microphone. The audience was quiet, sitting patiently, their faces open and expectant. They weren't here for cheap laughs. They were here to listen. When her name was called, she walked up to the stage. She wasn't wearing a uniform or a fancy outfit. She was just wearing her own clothes. She carried her worn, black notebook with her, the one that held all her secrets. She sat on the stool, her legs feeling a little shaky. She opened the notebook to a dog-eared page. She looked out at the quiet faces, took a deep breath, and began to read. She didn't tell the story of the king again. Instead, she read a small piece she had written about an old man who came into the diner every morning, ordering the same thing and the quiet, unspoken friendship he had with the cook. Her voice was soft, but it filled the room. There was no laughter, no applause. There was only a deep, profound silence. The audience was leaning forward, completely captivated. They weren't just listening to a story. They were seeing the world through her eyes. They were seeing the poetry in the mundane, the dignity in the ordinary. When she finished, she closed her notebook and looked up. For a moment, there was still silence. Then the room erupted in applause. It was different from the applause at the comedy club. It wasn't a roar of shock and defiance. It was a warm, genuine, and deeply appreciative sound. It was the sound of people being moved. She stood up, gave a small, shy smile, and walked off the stage. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was a storyteller, and she had finally found her stage.